So what is the matter here? Why are Western Europeans and others in the West so worried, even though they face relatively few attacks, and should consider themselves lucky to live in countries that are so much safer from terrorism than other parts of the world? Why is terrorism given so much priority, and why is the risk of terrorism perceived that high in Western societies? Well, first of all, in many Western countries, terrorism is a low probability, high impact risk. As mentioned before, terrorists do not primarily aim to kill people, but to have an impact on politics, on society. And terrorists manage to create that impact by selecting symbolic targets, such as places of worship, or places where a lot of people go to, public transportation, sport events, markets, cafes, tourist destinations, shopping malls. In other words, they strike at places where people in general, around the world, go to and can relate to. Think of the attack on the Westgate shopping mall in Kenya. To most people this is very far away, but on the other hand it raises the question, could this also happen in the shopping mall I often go to? More so than in the past. Terrorists are also helped to create an impact by the fact that images of attacks spread around the world in seconds, with the help of social media. And in the globalized, high-tech world in which we live, there's hardly a chance that a bloody attack will remain unnoticed. For example, in Beijing, the authorities tried to prevent the spread of images of a suicide attack which took place just outside the Forbidden Cities, back in October 2014. And they did so by forcing journalists to delete images from their cameras and by trying to take down pictures that had been posted online. But to no avail, as many images and accounts were still viewable a day after the attack. Finally, it's important to note that terrorism is a highly politicized threat, and that not only terrorists, but also others try to exploit attacks for political reasons. The American political scientist John Mueller, in his book Overblown, shows how politicians and what he calls the terrorism industry inflate the threat posed by terrorism, and thus, willingly, contribute to an increase of its impact. So what should be done to deal with the low probability, high impact threat of terrorism in Western societies? How can we make the chance of an attack, so the probability, as low as possible, and at the same time limit its impact? What approach should we take? Well, when it comes to the risk of terrorism, there is a high level of agreement among counter-terrorism experts that this threat should be dealt with by adopting a wide approach, a so-called comprehensive approach. Such an approach takes into account the blurring between internal and external security and international and domestic jurisdictions and state and non-state actors. It also stresses the importance to develop an effective approach to counter-terrorism that can apply across a broad variety of policy domains. It ranges from prevention of radicalization by social workers, teachers, families, to repressive measures by state actors. In such an approach, it is not only up to the intelligence community, the police, the judiciary and the military, but many others to limit the chance and to mitigate the consequences of a terrorist attack. Of course, partly because of the involvement of so many actors, there's a risk of doing too much, to overreact, especially in the aftermath of an attack. It's therefore important to follow the proportionality principle, meaning finding the correct balance between the measures imposed and the severity of the threat. And this ties directly back into our perceptions of the risk of terrorism as well. We tend to make the threat bigger than it actually is. Besides the fact that this means doing terrorists a favor, this is bad for several reasons. For instance, increased worries over terrorism can make societies more vulnerable to emotional, political and administrative overreactions. It can lead to hastened and drastic security measures and aggressive action towards perceived enemies in the hours and days after an attack. And this could lead to suboptimal policies and increased polarization and increase the damage done by the terrorist incidents themselves. According to the terrorism scholar Della Porta and others, terrorists specifically play into these vulnerabilities by way of spectacular attacks. Therefore, showing vulnerability is not a good thing. The British sociologist Frank Furedi even speaks of an invitation to terror. He shows how the impact of terrorism also depends on how we react to it and how feelings of vulnerability, fatalism and fear of terrorism can lead to more terrorism. So, by overreacting, we actually make it very attractive and very easy for terrorists to terrorize us. Portraying terrorism as a constant risk that is omnipresent and that countering terrorism is an unending struggle creates a self-fulfilling prophecy and in the end can make us less secure. And this is not to say that terrorism does not pose a threat, but it's important to realize that, at least in the West, it is a low probability threat. To sum up, in Western countries, and in fact in many other countries, terrorism is a low probability, high impact risk. There is a big gap between the perceived risk by the general public and politicians and the actual chance that people will become a victim of a terrorist attack. And this mismatch between the perceived and the actual risk can lead to overreactions, which has several negative consequences and which can lead to a self-fulfilling prophecy, an invitation to terror. So, in order to deal with this low probability, high impact threat, we should not only try to reduce the chance of a terrorist attack, but also focus, and perhaps focus a lot more, on mitigation of its impact. This is not an easy task, but one way in which this could be done is to enhance societal resilience to terrorism. Politicians could do so by refraining from bold statements and overreacting after an attack. Governments, but also citizens, can contribute by fostering positive coping mechanisms. Think of demonstrations such as the Flower March in Oslo after the Breivik attacks in 2011, in which 77 people were killed. By showing unity and strength, or undertaking all kinds of activities on social media, remembering the victims, or saying no to terrorism, the impact of attacks can be reduced. Increasing our societal resilience might help to make us a little less vulnerable to terrorists, who want to make us believe that they are a lot more threatening and a lot more powerful than they really are. I'm not afraid of terrorism, and I hope that after watching this video you are less afraid of terrorism as well. In Paris, just days after the Charlie Hebdo attacks, many went to the streets to say, "I'm not afraid."